So I was reading this article yesterday about Dr. Martens and how one of their activist investors, lovely term, was a bit disheartened with the progress with Dr. Martens since they went through the IPO a few years ago. Their share price has come down by about 60%, so it's a third of the initial IPO flotation price. And we can see that shareholders won't be too happy with that unless they can see light at the end of the tunnel. I thought this would be a good opportunity to revise corporate objectives, corporate influences, and shareholder versus stakeholders. So I've written a question for this and a mark scheme at the end of this video for you. There isn't an example essay with this one, but there's plenty enough for you to be getting on with once we've revised these key topics. So here's the question that we'll be sort of exploring in the mark scheme. So usual thing, likely impact is always going to be the start of, well, most of the time, start of our hook, and it's of something on something. So it's of a sale or a merger. Okay, so there's two key terms there, isn't there? So we're going to have to make sure that we have one pH, that's meant to be a K by the way for knowledge, one pH on a sale and one pH on a merger. There's other ways you could structure this. As suggested by Marathon Partners, if you read the article, you know who those are, on Dr. Martens. Now, when we see on Dr. Martens or on a company like Dr. Martens, the first thing we need to know is we need to know what their corporate objectives are. Now, if you look through the case study, there's examples of a number of corporate objectives, and there's also lots of information about shareholder objectives as well. Okay, so this is the standard technique that we would use with writing this sort of question, but actually we're just going to link it directly into the theory from theme 3 for these 3 units. Okay, so that's important, and 12 markers so you can do a MOPS. I haven't put MOPS in the mark scheme, but the overall conclusions I've phrased in positives or negatives as in questions to prompt you to think about it instead of just giving you what I think might be a reasonable answer. Pause the video, read the case study. Did you pause the video? Nope. Okay, so looking at these units individually, so I've broken this down into the bullet points from the awarding body specification, and then I've just described them. So this is basic definitions, and all of your units, I'm sure, you've got define the key terms, pros and cons, and we're going to do the pros and cons in context with the case study that you should have just read. So we know that these are targets set by the company, and we're thinking about the strategic direction. So corporate objectives at the top of the pyramid that you would study in class, you'll see mission statement, which is this sometimes rather vague overview of what we want to achieve, and then your corporate objectives and your strategies are towards the, a bit below the mission statement there. Okay, so we're looking for what those are, and if we think about the sale or the merger, then what we have here is we've got stagnant growth at the moment. The share price seems deeply discounted, but we have got this famous Dr. Martens brand though, so we're looking for some of those things that might be classed as those corporate objectives in there, and we think about how the sale or merger might be able to help with those, or help achieve those, or help the company get back on track. Remember, the share price is a third of what it was when they first floated. There was obviously a lot of anticipation that this would be a hugely successful growth opportunity, using that money from the IPO to launch Dr. Martens into the United States. Didn't quite work out though. And then we've got obviously some of the cons there. Well, if you suddenly start selling this, maybe that initial foundation objectives aren't going to be fulfilled. Now, when we saw the Rolex case study, can't remember which year that was, last year or the year before, and they were talking about the the founding principles of the company. Okay, so you can always link back to those. If they mention them in the case study, you can say, however, you might be moving further away. That was an IPO question as well, actually. Then if we're thinking about the mission statement, critically appraising them is, as it says here, the rigorous examination of the mission statements and corporate aims. Thinking about how this is steering the company. How relevant is it to the current marketplace? Well, have a look for that when you're in the case studies and just think, how relevant is selling it? Or is this short-termism versus long-termism, which is obviously something we'll be coming on to in a second. Okay, you can read the rest of that. Excuse me. So here we are, short-termism versus long-termism. And reading this article, one thing that struck me was, yes, this activist investor wants to get his money back, wants to actually get the growth opportunity he thought he was going to get. And maybe he thinks if they sell this, they're going to get more than the current share price. So when it says heavily discounted share price, I'm not sure that he wants to sell it at that rate. That's not how the article reads. I think it might be an opportunity to drum up some interest. Remember, the price will be directly linked to how many people are interested in buying it, and maybe he can get even more than a third back. Maybe he wants to get rid of his shares, but just doesn't want to sell them at the current price. So merging with someone else might actually bring more money to him as a shareholder. Selling it might get him more money than he's currently going to get if he just sells his shares this afternoon on the stock market. So we need to think about the motives of this activist shareholder. Okay, and they come across as relatively short-termist. And I don't think this investor, from reading the article, is interested in the long-term success of Dr. Martens. Or maybe he thinks things could get even worse. If you read other reviews about Dr. Martens, actually the quality that they've got their reputation from isn't what it used to be. There's this guy on YouTube that takes shoes apart to double check what they were all made of and everything else. And he's given scathing reviews for Dr. Martens over the last couple of years because they've outsourced their manufacturing to cheaper production locations, cheaper materials, and therefore the brand quality is not what it used to be, okay, according to him. Now, if we're thinking about evidence versus subjective decisions, I think that this is a great case study to explore that as well. Because actually, if we look at the evidence, the share price is a third what it used to be. If we look at sales in the United States, they are lower than expected. So we've got the actual evidence-based linked to decision making, okay? But the subjective side of it might be more short-termist. The subjective might be, I don't like the current direction of the company and I don't think things are going to get any better. So you have to think about that, and that's great because we can use past sales data and that subjective perspective and question the reliability of that data moving forward from a forecasting perspective. So if we think about pros and cons, well, there we go. So we're short-termist. They thought they were going to get their money back and make a load of money, but hey, didn't happen, did it? Things didn't quite work out. And it might be the long-termist side of it is, I'm thinking about sustainability. I'm thinking about, yes, the growth isn't where it wants to be at the moment, but will it get where it needs to in the future? Let's not have knee-jerk reactions and suddenly just change the company structure overnight just because over the last couple of years we've not seen the growth that we expected. Okay, and I think I've done the rest of it. So yeah, just supply chains. There have been some problems which I mentioned with that guy on YouTube. Yeah, so that's not so much supply chain issues, other than probably Dr. Martens have decided they want to make more profit, and therefore they've asked their supply chain to use substandard materials. Okay, I don't think the supply chain would suddenly start using substandard materials, when you outsource production to a company, you get what's in the contract normally. So my gut feeling is the quality of Dr. Martens is a strategic decision by Dr. Martens. So stakeholders versus shareholders. So lots here to get through. So we've got those internal and external stakeholders. They're listed in here, and that could be the supply chain. It could be the customers. It could be the shareholders, who could be employees. Okay, so we have to think about this, and also, if it's a global company, those stakeholder groups might have more or less investment in the brand. So the brand is a lot more established in the UK, for example, and it's growing, hopefully, in the United States. So you might have some die-hard, loyal Doc Marten fans in the UK who've been wearing them since, I don't know, the 1960s. Whereas in the United States, it's become more of a fashion brand, as in the UK now anyway. Whereas before it was that sturdy work boot, and even though it was very fashionable, gosh, I remember when I was at school, you'd see mods and skinheads walking around in Doc Martens, so they were a fashion statement then. But there you go. Yes, I am an old Dalmatian. Stakeholder objectives, we need to think about, are these focused on purely profit, sales and other things, or are we talking about environmentalism, working conditions, ethical brands? We know there's a big growth in vegan Dr. Marten boots, for example. So is that something to do with their ethical considerations, or is that them just selling more boots because of a growing social trend? Probably the latter. And if you think about the conflicts here, well, this article is a fantastic opportunity to explore conflicts between shareholders and stakeholders. The stakeholders could be the staff, could be the board of directors. They're employees, aren't they? The shareholder in this case study is clearly the activist shareholder that wants to either sell or merge with another brand. So we've got some pros and cons there for you to consider when you're thinking about answering this 12-mark question. These are not the only answers, by the way, but I wanted to explore these 3 units very briefly. Make sure you've got your definitions. I would advise you to always have your pros and cons in context with a company that you understand. Okay, choose a couple of different companies, different sectors when you're doing your notes, but you'll remember the context. And then hopefully when you go into the exam hall this summer and you're writing definitions, they'll all be contextual. It's so much easier to write contextualized answers than it is to write abstract stuff that looks like it's been copied out of a textbook. Okay, and the first option obviously achieves you a lot higher grades. So here is the question. Yeah, so we know that this is the hook. Impact of a sale or a merger. So you're going to need to talk about both probably. And I would start with the definition of both. Yeah, so you don't need to write a lot. Here's a definition of both in one sentence. What this will do is it will give your answer the foundations that you need. And yes, this is very textbooky. This is not contextualized, but what it does is it helps you to focus your answer. Okay, you've got some possible positives and negatives there, and you'll see that these are not just these are the answers. I've phrased these like they're questions. I want you to think about how could you consider the potential loss of their independence. Okay, and each one of them has got some case study evidence there for you to help you with your answers. You should really pause the video at this point and go away and write your 12 marker. Because we've explored it and you've read a mark scheme, I would not spend more than 12 minutes writing it, because you're probably going to spend maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 minutes planning this type of thing. So you may as well get used to writing 1 minute per mark. Remember, we are not aiming for perfection. We are aiming for level 4. This is roughly the structure that we would expect But remember, if you can't think of an in-context MOPS, don't bother writing one. Okay? There's no point in you writing standard off-the-shelf answers. Just because it worked once with one of your essays with your teachers does not mean it will work for every single essay. Okay, so avoid some of those TikTok revision videos that you see that everything ends in sales and profits. Well, clearly on Dr. Martens, sales and profits might be very nice because it might help them improve their share price, hey? But let's just make sure that even sales, profits and share price are in context. There's enough evidence in this case study to do this. If you want to read the original article, which is a lot more in depth than the case study I've included, whiz back to the beginning of this video, find the hyperlink on the first slide. Hopefully that was useful. Have a good day.